published widely in artificial intelligence and in ethics of robotics and AI, including a contribution to the Oxford, I'm sure I'm going to get this right, but it's the Oxford
Handbook of Ethics and Artificial Intelligence.
There you go. That was it. He also has a paper. I have copies here. I'm going to step over this way. If anyone is interested, I have a copy of printed out copies of a paper that he wrote on trust and cooperation. And because I love bibliographies, I actually just cheated and printed off the reading list from this course from this spring, but it has a lot of great references, and if you're interested, I printed off copies for that too, and we can get those at the end. I have a copy of printed out copies of the paper that he wrote on trust and cooperation. Things to say, and I really because I love bibliographies. Besides introducing Ben, which is of course I actually the point of me being cheated here. And printed off the reading list from this course from this spring, really but it has a lot of great references, and if you're interested, I printed off copies for that too.
Let me start out
and we can get this at the end. I have a copy of
myself.
I printed out copies of the paper that he wrote on trust and cooperation. Things to say, and because I love bibliographies, besides introducing Ben, I actually just cheated and printed off the reading list from this course from this spring, but it has a lot of great references, and if you're interested, I printed off copies for that too.
I got to know,
and we can get this at the end. I have a copy, I printed out copies of the paper that he wrote on trust and cooperation. Things to say, and because I love bibliographies, besides introducing Ben, I actually just cheated and printed off the reading list from this course from this spring, but it has a lot of great references, and if you're interested, I printed off copies for that too. And we can get this at the end. I have a copy, I printed out copies of the paper that he wrote on trust and cooperation. Things to say, and because I love bibliographies, besides introducing Ben, I went to my reading list from this course from this spring, but it has a lot of great references,
and never touch anything applied, and I took a course from this crazy person, I teach at the Sky, and I realized this is what I've always wanted.
Because I love bibliographies.
So the point of AI is teaching computational methods to describe the phenomena of mind. Never touch the mind is obviously an ideal phenomenon in the world, like gravity or anything else. And so the question has been for thousands of years, how do we describe what the mind is and how it works? Now, I see AI as providing a kind of mathematics for describing the mind in the same way that differentiation provides a kind of mathematics for describing the physical world. And that's a foundation for creating science in the mind. So what really drives me is the science of it. But of course, the technicalities of it, the engineering of it, creating an impactful technology is also a very important thing, and it's been getting a huge amount of attention in the last decade or so. Back in the day when I got started with this, it's the only teacher I used, so I felt right at home. So when I thought about the mind, I thought, well, there's an awful lot of things having to do with the mind, and you can sort of roughly categorize it in terms of perception, thinking, and acting, with several subcategories in there. And if I wanted to do it really easy, I was going to have to narrow down and focus down. And so what I decided was that I would focus on common sense knowledge. And it's sort of rough. People have a hard time figuring out what that is, and I have a few humble opinions. So when we go and look at common sense knowledge, some of that has to do with knowledge of the physical world. So I did my PhD thesis and a lot of work ever since then on navigational physics. So I walked into this building for the very first time years ago, and so I followed a path to get out here, and I know it has to do with something, knowledge of the physical world. I might be able to find my way back out with a lot of work ever since then, probably, but not necessarily. And so it raises a bunch of interesting questions about intuitive knowledge. How do we build a model of space you guys know this building intimately, and so you know how the parts of it all fit together. I don't. Probably not necessarily. And so it raises a bunch of interesting questions about interesting knowledge. How do we build a model of space? You guys know this building intimately, and so you know how the parts of it all fit together. I don't. What the situation is, what to do, what their goals are, what to do. And so this includes and theory of mind. I have perceptions of the world. I have goals. I decide to take actions. What the situation is, what to do, what their goals are, what to do. And so this includes and theory of mind. I have perceptions of the world. I have goals. I decide to take actions. What the situation is, what to do, what their goals are, what to do. And so this includes and theory of mind. I have perceptions of the world. I have goals. I decide to take actions. What the situation is, what to do, what their goals are, what to do. And so this includes and theory of mind. I have perceptions of the world. I have goals. I decide to take actions. What the situation is, what to do, what their goals are, what to do. And so this includes and theory of mind. I have engineering, they aren't making ethical decisions of their own. So, partly, just like building AI models gives us insights into what human intelligence is all about, building AI models of ethics can help give us insights into what human ethics is about. Now, the philosophers have been working on this for 2,500 years, plus or minus, and we have a huge amount to learn from the philosophers, but we have some things of our own to contribute as well, so it's worth thinking about this from that perspective. And then these are various issues dealing with autonomy and safety. What about autonomous cars? Privacy, surveillance. There's a lot of surveillance out there, a lot of information about you. What shall we do? Fairness, bias, jobs, economic inequality. And people are fretting about whether there are existential risks to humanity or our society. Now, I'm going to go into a little more detail about the trust and cooperation part and about safety and jobs. But there's plenty more to be said about the others as well. A lot of my goal as a teacher is to get my students to take these questions seriously, because the students are almost entirely taking technical courses that say, here's a problem, here's a section that you've studied, here are equations to use, here's your goal, achieve the goal, be an engineer. And a course like this overlaps a lot with humanities courses, liberal arts courses, and says things like which goals should be pursued. When are we looking at things adequately? When are we maybe not looking at things adequately? Turns out the students are just hungry for this kind of thing. So a lot of students, some students get very impatient. They say, why aren't you teaching us some technical stuff? And I say, well, pay attention, read the papers. You can focus on more technical aspects of this. But lots of the students are really hungry for material having to do with ethics. What's okay? So, starting in this, one of the real questions to my mind was to say, okay, well, what is ethics anyway? Why do we have it? We as humans feel like ethics is an important part of our life. But why? What are the pragmatic benefits of it? Well, one way to think is that each of us is an agent. We make decisions about what to do, and that decision has impact, both on our own personal situation, but on the whole society that we're in. And there are temptations to say, well, let me just focus on me, because I'm the center of the universe. Why not? Why should I pay any attention to anybody else? This turns out not to be a good strategy. And so, having sort of scrambled around for a fair while, this is the kind of picture of that I've come up with, which is to say, what do we need for society to function? So if my society is thriving, then I am going to thrive. I will be relatively better off. How does society thrive? Well, it turns out game theory provides us with some useful mathematics in that area. And among other things, it distinguishes between what they call positive sum games, things that are cooperative, where we interact and we both come out ahead. Zero sum games, most recreational games, chess or checkers or tennis or whatever, are zero sum, and negative sum games. If you pick my pocket, I am worse off. You're a little better off, but not much, I can tell you that. And I'm significantly worse off, so the sum goes down. And so if you think about the society, if the kinds of interactions that go on within the society are predominantly positive sum, so we are predominantly playing these cooperative games, the society does better. That level of analysis doesn't say anything about how the distribution is going. But if the society is getting better, then it's getting more resources, it's able to defend against threats, it's able to take advantage of opportunities. Now, that comes from cooperation. producing positive sum outcomes. Now, cooperation necessarily involves vulnerability because your partners can drop the ball in various ways and you can be left worse off. So in order to cooperate effectively, you have to trust. And I'll define trust in just a minute. But you have to trust that your partner will not exploit you, will not exploit your vulnerability. Trust is a good thing if your partners are trustworthy. And it's a bad thing if they're not. So when we go from trust, the trustworthiness is important. And so finally we get back to ethics. So ethics is a body of knowledge that comes from the society. In a lot of cases it's transmitted by religious groups, but not all cases. And it tells people how to be trustworthy. It also tells people how to tell whether other people are trustworthy. And so this is a very high-level, broad brush picture. But an important thing about it is that trust is really kind of at the center point of this. And there's a lot more to be said about that, which I won't say now. So what is trust? Well, I hunted around. It's one of these little words that, of course, are the hardest ones to define. And I found a good definition in the management literature. Trust is a psychological state comprising the intention to accept vulnerability based on positive expectations of the intentions or behavior of another. So, I trust you, I accept vulnerability with the belief that you're not going to exploit my vulnerability. So what's trustworthiness? Well, actually another thing in the management literature says this comes from beliefs about the ability, the benevolence, and the integrity of the other. Doesn't have quite as crisp a quote. And so trying to say that is, it's the willingness to honor previous commitments, even in situations when you've discovered you could do something better otherwise. So, now there are several cross-cutting themes that I've identified as we go along, and one of them is this point I've already made, which is that trust and cooperation are central to the success of society. And individuals depend on how well their society does. If your society is doing badly, then you are probably also doing badly. Another issue that I won't have too much time to go into is that a lot of times ethical failures are due to what I sometimes call invisible hazards. That you have a model of the world and it simply doesn't include something which is a genuine hazard. So let's look at climate change. Once upon a time, we figured that fossil fuels were given to us to provide energy for all sorts of things, and people would have these portrait photographs of factories belching smoke into the atmosphere because the atmosphere is infinitely large and you can just pour stuff into it and it'll all get taken care of. And the ocean is infinitely large and the forests are infinitely large and you simply don't have to worry about those things. And so you don't. Well, turns out you do. So that was wrong. But 200, 300, 400 years ago, that was pretty much right. That the natural processes could take care of all of that stuff. But as the time has gone by, it turns out that we had made decisions using overly simple models that have led to bad results. And so models, when you think of the models that we use to think about the world, a model necessarily omits a lot of things because you can't think about everything. It's too complicated. And so if the thing it's omitting are critical, you may be in trouble. One example, I like to say trust is a capital asset. Let's think about Boeing. Yeah, right. So Boeing is a company that had a huge amount of trust, and it was for its focus on high quality engineering and safety. And as time went by, it got acquired by companies that were much more interested in making profits. Now, it turns out you can increase your profits by cutting corners, and you can cut a lot of corners before you get into trouble. But at a certain point, you cut enough corners and you do get into trouble, and Boeing has been in the news, not in a good way. And so the trust that people have had for Boeing is a capital asset that it has squandered, and it is suffering. It may or may not survive. Now, I talk about Boeing almost as though it's an AI. Is it an AI? Maybe. It's artificial. It's a goal-oriented problem solver. It has knowledge. Contrary to what Mitt Romney says, it is not people. It is made of people and a bunch of other stuff. And the people that it is made of are replaceable parts. So this starts looking a lot like the way I would talk about an AI. So I work in an AI lab, and we have computers and robots and stuff like that. And our AIs are built out of digital computers and the programs we build. But it may be that there are AIs out there that have already been out there and have been out there for centuries now and control most of the wealth of the human race and make hugely powerful, impactful decisions. So I'm going to spend time thinking about my kind of robots, the kinds that are built on digital computers, but keep this in mind. Now, corporations are also made of things like corporate procedures, many documents, committees that do things. And for a while I was thinking, oh, we ought to get rid of corporations. They do all this terrible stuff. But in fact, they're also mechanisms for cooperation. And I'm already committed to the point that cooperation is valuable. Now, there's plenty of things that are valuable but dangerous. Think of a circular saw. So you just have to know how to be careful enough. So let's drill down. So drilling down a little bit, we got to make decisions. Boink. So here we are, sailing along, and at a certain point, we have a choice. Let's say, for simplicity, it's between A and B, whatever A and B are. What should we do? Well, obviously the details, the devil is in the details. So we have to figure out, they're really, given this way of formulating the problem, we really have to choose the greater good or the lesser harm, depending on which way you do that. And so often we try to formalize this with a utility function. And that utility says, I mean, how valuable is it to be in state A versus state B? And so if it's better to be in A than to be in B, then you take the left hand, otherwise you take the right hand. Seems pretty clear. Well, sometimes A and B are both wonderful, but they're very different. And so it can be a hard choice because they represent different futures. A friend of mine in graduate school got 2 very different, very wonderful job offers. Anybody else would have been overjoyed to get just one of them, and he had both. But they were so different, he went through the torments of hell trying to decide which to do. But sometimes they're both terrible. And this is what I call a deadly dilemma. And they can be heartbreaking. And you can be in a situation where you do this or you do that, and they're both terrible, and what do you do? And then you say, I better call up an ethicist. Help me out. That's probably not going to help as much as you hope. Well, the people who are investigating autonomous vehicles wanted to formulate something like that. And they were inspired by an obscure philosophical thought experiment called the trolley problem, which is fun to give a lecture on, but I won't. So here is the version that got constructed. It says, suppose you have an autonomous vehicle, and it's zooming along the road. There's no shoulders, you can't pull over, you're going too fast to slow down. All of a sudden, some pedestrians, are crossing the road. And if you cross the road and hit them, you'll kill them all. On the other hand, your only other choice is you could crash into this barrier and kill all the passengers in your car. A versus B, what do you do? So they did this online, and they asked people, pick A, pick B, and they gave different demographic information about the pedestrians and the passengers, and they analyzed the answers they got. They got 40 million responses from 233 countries. I think this is a stupid experiment. And actually, the people who actually work on autonomous vehicles also think it's a stupid experiment. But it's something that people like to say, well, here's a moral dilemma. What do you do? So I'm putting it back in this little diagram. Suppose you are going down that narrow road, and here you are, your pedestrian appears. You can either kill the pedestrian or you can kill the passenger. What should you do? Well, turns out this is a misleading formulation of the problem. And so the actual answer is that there was an upstream decision point. So at a certain point, you turned into this narrow road, and you had a decision. Do you go fast like you were before, or do you go slow? And if you go fast, you're faced with this decision, and both answers are wrong. You have no good choice. Whereas, if you noticed and made the right decision at the upstream decision point, then you go slow, the pedestrian appears, you stop safely, and you're not killing anybody. Whew. Now, in fact, we teach this to every 15 and 16-year-old as they take driver's ed, right? We have a curriculum, and we give them little puzzles like, what do you do if you see a ball bouncing into the road? Well, what you do is you slam on the brakes, right? Because the ball might be followed by a kid. The ball is not a threat, but it's a clue. And so, now, people ask, they say, well, there you are, you're faced with this dilemma. You can't go back in time. Time travel is impossible. Well, yes and no. If you're faced with that choice between two terrible alternatives, then yeah, you can't jump back in time. But if you're teaching a student, you can teach them to look ahead in time and anticipate that. If you're programming up a system that is supposed to drive an autonomous vehicle, it's your responsibility, both as the teacher, as the student, as the programmer, to look ahead in time to anticipate that, that deadly dilemma. And but you can also learn from other experiences that are near misses. We've all had near misses. I'm going to bet right offhand that none of you have actually faced personally a deadly dilemma like this where you had to choose kill A or kill B. I have very occasionally in an audience seen that, but hardly ever. But you can learn from a near miss, you can learn from somebody else's terrible experience. And what you need to do is to learn to anticipate that upstream decision point. Now, when you think about terrible moral dilemmas, there's no guarantee that there was an upstream decision point. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes people are simply faced with a horrible, horrible choice between two things. But a lot of times there is. And so I think the ethical lesson for people working on artificial intelligence and for people thinking about ethical choices in the rest of the world is to look ahead into the future so that you can detect when there is this upstream decision point. Now it turns out Aristotle knew all about this stuff. Aristotle said, you know, ethics is really just a skill like carpentry or anything else. You practice, you get better. And he had a word in Greek, it's phronesis. It means practical wisdom. And if you train yourself to detect various upstream decision points, then more often than before, you take this branch and you don't face the dilemma at all. Life is better. So, my claim is that this is one of the ethical lessons that we can learn. And it's not a brand new lesson. People have been teaching this lesson forever. People who teach driver's ed have been using it forever. And there's an awful lot of other circumstances when this is taught. But thinking about it from an AI and robotics point of view says, I got to figure out how to program this up. How do we implement this so that a robot can do it? Any questions on this? Because I'm about to shift gears to another major dilemma or problem. And that is jobs. Oh. So, yeah.
Before we shift gears, the concept of a machine making that decision or a person making the decision, one can be programmed, one can be learned. But my intuition says that the machine actually, if it's programmed correctly, makes that decision better than a human can be learned. Is that a conclusion or not?
Not clear. I think one of the things that we've learned from the last 10 years or so of deep neural networks, we were in a situation where we could program up certain decisions, but we couldn't seem to figure out how to accurately program something that could reliably tell the difference between a puppy and a kitten. This is very frustrating. So we could do all sorts of other stuff, but we couldn't tell the difference between puppies and kittens. And it wasn't just that. I mean, there were lots and lots of other examples. And then the deep neural network technology came along, And if you train the heck out of these things with millions, hundreds of millions, billions of examples, then they can tell the difference between puppies and kittens. How do they do that? We don't know. This is a terribly disturbing fact. They can learn a bunch of these things. They do it. We can test them. They perform well on these A versus B distinctions, but we don't know how or why. Now, this is, from an academic point of view, this is a fabulous academic challenge, and there are hundreds of PhD theses being written on what in the world are they doing. Now, you said you can program the computer to make the right decision. Well, if it's a simple, clear decision, I mean, if you're programming a thermostat, then you know what you're measuring. You're measuring the temperature. But if you're making a decision between some of these more deeply textured alternatives, we don't know how to program it. Maybe we know how to train it in a deep neural network, but maybe we don't. And we don't understand them well enough to be sure. So that's why I don't want to give you false confidence. But I don't want to say it's all terrible either. Yeah.
Isn't there a question about the diversity of the material that's used to train AI? So that there's a real upstream problem of what is the encyclopedia of knowledge produced around the world that you're using upon which to train the AI.
Absolutely there is.
There's a lot of problems with that.
Absolutely there is. And so what they primarily do right now is they scrape a huge amount of knowledge off the internet. So start with everything on Wikipedia. Start with all of the novels and stories that are available online. Start with all of the scientific papers that are online. Now, those are written by certain subsets of the world population. And those, the distribution of people who are the authors of those is different from the distribution of people in the world. In some cases, that means that you're not paying attention to certain subpopulations. And that's when we get to the fairness and bias, which we won't spend much time on, then that's one of the issues.
Isn't it also a language issue?
Yeah.
That is, it tends to scrape for English primarily.
Yeah, and other major languages.
And other major languages.
But there are minor languages, and there are projects that are working on learning minor languages, but there's a far smaller literature written in those minor languages. And so what if there is some deep insight to be gotten from that? Hard to say. When we advance in technology, then robots or machinery comes along and does certain kind of work that humans had been doing before. Once upon a time, roughly 90% of the people worked in agriculture. Today it's about 2%. So that means that there's 88% of these people no longer had agricultural jobs. Well, fortunately, as we look back by centuries, we say, well, all the manufacturing jobs came. Well, they didn't come all at once, and so some individuals were really cooked. They didn't have jobs, they didn't have alternatives, but over generations, the workforce shifted to do manufacturing. And then we got more technology, and we got more new jobs in service industries, even as mechanical robots were able to do various kinds of manufacturing jobs. And now what we're doing is we're finding that deep neural networks, ChatGPT, stuff like this, can do a lot of the stuff that let's say, the bottom half of the graduating class of any given law school can do. So if you're going to graduate in the bottom half or the bottom third of your law school class, your job prospects are not nearly as good as they were 10 years ago. And this goes on to other areas as well. And so you can start thinking, ooh, once upon a time, we counted on the blind hand of the market to create these new jobs. Are we still going to be able to do that? That's less clear. Will there be jobs left for people, or will we get this dystopian scenario? Does it matter? All those people who don't have jobs to give, well, what do we care? We've got 401ks. Watch out for people with pitchforks and torches. What should we do about it? Now, I talked earlier about simple models. In 1970, Milton Friedman, brilliant man, deeply evil, I believe, published a paper in the New York Times Magazine, actually, saying the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. He was fighting against a corporate social responsibility movement. And he's very persuasive. But I think that this is a particular message with a particular narrow model that has caused a lot of damage. Now, he's not responsible for everything, but I pick him as my poster child. There's lots of other people who are equally responsible. This has had some implications for economic inequality. So if we look at the productivity of the economy, it's been rising pretty monotonically since the end of World War II. Pretty evenly, linearly. The distribution of that has not been quite so simple. And actually, you can trace it up to about 1980. And then for the working class, it levels off. For other people, it goes up. Now, this goes from 1980. And if you say, well, okay, who is getting their fair share of the wealth that the economy is producing? Well, it's the people in the 90th to 99th percentile, the upper middle class. You and me, by the way. And other people, like the bottom 50% is here, the middle 40% is there. The rest of the top 1% is way up here, and the 0.01% is way the heck up there. How do you think people feel about that? So, one of the things is that a lot of people feel that that level of inequality is unfair. There is an axiom about the ways that cooperation works. You feel like if you are going to cooperate to produce wealth, you should get a share, a reasonable share of that wealth. And thanks to certain influential people, that's not happening. And so it's been well documented that deaths of despair are increasing. Social mobility is decreased. We like to think that this is a mobile society. Well, it's much less true than advertised. It increases hopelessness. How many of you remember the story of Solomon? Not Solomon, Samson. Samson. He was in a tough situation. And it was the best choice for him was to pull down the pillars of the temple, killing himself and a whole lot of other people. The interesting thing is that that attitude is visible in our society. Very interesting article whose title is "This Political Philosopher Predicted the Rise of Donald Trump." His name was Hunter S. Thompson. How many of you remember Hunter Thompson?
Fear and Loathing.
Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and other places.
Doctor of gonzo journalism.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So what can we do? Automation of various kinds creates more wealth for society, eliminates jobs. People actually need meaningful work. They don't just want it, but they need it. And in fact, there are a lot of jobs that need to be done to help give us a good society. And I use as my sort of poster for this kind of thing are the care jobs: child care, elder care, health care, environment care, and so forth. We already have a bunch of jobs. I'll come back to that actually. The interesting thing about these care jobs is that they're not profit centers. That is, they are not jobs that get created because some entrepreneur sees a way of getting more profit by hiring more people. And that is the picture that Milton Friedman was pushing. So, but we already create jobs that are subsidized by our society because we believe they are good for our society. And they're things like public schools, fire departments, defense, and so forth. So what we're going to need to do, we can create jobs to employ all those people who are losing their jobs. But it has to be a matter of societal will. We have to decide to do it and then do it. It's not simply saying, well, the invisible hand of the market will make it happen. That worked in the past. It's not going to work in the future because of the power of the technology. But we can create a better society. We've got the money. We've got the people. We can find the jobs. Now, you say, hold it, I thought you were talking about robots. Well, actually I am, but because corporations are robots. They are goal-oriented artificial problem solvers, motivated to increase a certain utility function, and they act in the world. So we need them to act in a in an ethical way. Now, there's a bunch of other topics, and of course I have privacy and surveillance were observed all the time. They know unbelievable amounts of information about you and your life, which they aggregate, correlate, and sell. So they collect it from all sorts of sources. They sell it to data brokers who analyze the details of this, and then they sell it to advertisers, or to police departments, or to political campaigns, or a variety of other people who want this information. We need to spend weeks and months thinking about that and how to control it. Fairness and bias. What does fair actually mean? We got a nice, solid mathematical result that says there are a bunch of different proposed definitions of fair, and you can't achieve them all. In certain other fields, people have had alternate definitions, and they turned out to be equivalent. Not true with fairness. So how do we decide what we want? We clearly don't want these things to act in biased ways. But what does that mean? This turns out to be hard. Will super intelligent AI kill us all? Skynet from Terminator 2. Are we going to get things that are super intelligent so we can't control them? Super powerful so they can do horrible things to us? Now, if I look at the scenarios that are proposed, and it's fiction writers who are proposing this stuff, mostly the AIs are not super intelligent, but they've been given superpower. So we better be pretty careful with superpower. So that sort of covers a bunch of things that I cover in a semester-long course. So you have to write a term paper. So I don't promise to grade it. I'm still in the middle of this. So what I'm trying to tell students is the key question is, what should you do with your life? You have a bunch of talents. You have a bunch of opportunities. What's the most important thing that you can do? Do that. Now, here we are. You and I are in the sort of waning decades of life, but we do have a little more money than we had when we were students in college, and we have decisions to make. What do you do with your life? And one of the lessons that I do tell the students is, don't tell me I have no choice. That's a very popular answer to some of these questions. I want to go on and work in artificial intelligence and get a job as a professor in artificial intelligence, but I really have no choice about whether I'm going to take military funding. Of course you have a choice. There's costs and benefits, but there's a choice. And you need to think about them. There's risks, there's opportunities. What are you going to do? And the notion of the upstream decision point is a valuable one. What are the upstream decision points? And how do you, here again, I'm talking to students who are in the process of preparing themselves for the rest of their lives. But you and I, we have decades and decades behind us, and we have some years, maybe decades, ahead of us. And we have decisions to make. How do we prepare ourselves to make those choices? Thank you. Mary.
Benjamin, I want you to give that presentation for the Ross College of Business. Let us take away that Milton Friedman model of it's only for profit.
Yeah. I actually have I have a guest lecturer named Jerry Davis, who's a professor there, and he is a very good guy and who has a bunch of interesting things to say about corporations. Yeah.
Actually, before it was Ross, there was a group there that delved into it, which had the lovely title of the Cognitive Science and Machine Intelligence Laboratory, that was run by two psychology professors, married, by the way, the Olsons, I think. And they battled with AI before there were neural nets. And so people have been trying to solve this. The business community has incentives because they like to understand the source of funds. And normally they can find funds and then get people to answer the questions you posed. I wanted to propose an answer if the cat and puppy thing hasn't been solved.
It has. But, yeah.
Are you presenting this to the IOE department as well? Because I think a lot of this modeling is really operations research based.
Yeah.
The ethical component was discussed way back when I was involved in that, but it was never resolved. It's a stochastic model that you're really working with.
Right. I mean, these models come from across the fields in engineering. And part of the thing is that the world is infinitely complex. And so we can't think about that much complexity. So what we have to do is we have simple finite models. And if what you're trying to do is to say, okay, if I drop a rock on the ground, then gravity is going to accelerate it and it's going to go and hit the ground. And I can predict how long it'll take and so forth. If I want to jump off the roof, I can use that model and it will do a pretty good job of predicting when I'm going to hit the ground and how fast I'll be going, and I can probably predict the probability that I'll break a leg. If I want to jump out of an airplane, that model isn't quite right, because it'll predict, the model that I was sketching out will predict that I hit the ground a lot faster than I actually do, because I left out air resistance. And air resistance, when you jump out of something that's really high, it will slow you down proportionally to how fast you're going to go. Now, if you jump out of an airplane, you're still going to die when you hit the ground, but it's proportional to the cross-section. So if you go like this, you'll slow down more than if you go like this. And if you have a parachute that artificially increases your cross-section by a huge amount, you might well survive. So there are a variety of models. Every model is oversimplified. Some of them are useful, but some of them are not useful. And one of the ones, this is one that I think we are now getting into a phase of the world where this is not useful. It has some partial value, but it's also can mislead us in a serious way.
Time for one more question. We have 2 minutes left on my watch.
Okay. Okay.
So, in these things that you're coming up, these models that you have, this model of freedom versus that model of the Deaths of Despair by Pace and Deegan, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, these models really have underlying different value structures. And so there's really an opposition of values, right, that's at work here.
Mhm.
So how do you see the resolution of that?
Well, I think we as a society are going to have to decide on certain value propositions. Some of the problems come up because people don't see it as an explicit choice between values. They just say, here's a model, and it omits this other stuff. And they may not even say it omits this other stuff. They'll say it makes explicit the stuff we ought to think about. And the value is kind of hidden in the things it doesn't say. There's a rhetorical trick, which is to embed the controversial statement in the presupposition of my sentence. When did you stop beating your wife? Because, now, yes or no? I mean, or have you stopped beating your wife? Yes or no? Now, that carries an unstated presupposition, which presumably is quite controversial, but it's not explicit. So it's very easy to overlook that kind of thing. Of course we can pump air, pollution into the air and into the ocean, because the air is infinite and the ocean is infinite. Well, it's not. Anyway, I should let you get to your service. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tissue is just